I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today. I'm really excited to make this video today because we're going to be looking at a new feature of Betaflight 4.0 called the RPM filter. And I know that every time a new version of Betaflight is on deck, it's coming out in a month or so, every time that happens, there's this excitement about new features that it's going to have that are going to change everything, make your quad fly amazing. But the RPM filter really is exciting and important and a big deal, and today I'm going to show you why. All right, folks, for this first flight, this is Betaflight 4.0 with the RPM filter active and the dynamic filter active. So those two notch filters are the only ones that are active. I have disabled literally every other filter in Betaflight. The D-term low pass, all the notches, and yes, even the gyro low pass. And this is a big freaking deal because if you go right now and disable your gyro low pass, chances are very good that your quad won't even fly. So let's see how it flies. Let's start by talking about what's filtering and why is it important. And the short version of that, I am capable of doing the short version. The short version is that filtering removes the motor vibration from the PID loop and lets the PID loop focus on the actual movement of the quad, the flying of the quad. Filtering, that's what filtering does. And the way that filtering works right now is there are some low pass filters. The movement of the quad is low frequency. The motors are higher frequency. So if we put a low pass filter in, it basically turns down the treble, if you will, and it attenuates the motor vibration. But those low pass filters are not as effective as we would like them to be, and they have some drawbacks. So we also use a kind of filter called a notch filter, and a notch filter, instead of just rolling off the whole treble of the motor vibrations, it targets the motor vibration specifically, the exact frequency of the motor vibration. Well, there's some problems with the notch filters as well. One of the problems is that in order to tune those notch filters, you have to first measure the motor vibration using the gyro, and then take the gyro data and do some analysis on it to figure out what frequency the motors are spinning at, and then tune the notch filter to match that frequency. And the RPM filter short circuits that. What the RPM filter does is it lets the ESC tell the flight controller, here's what the motor RPM is. 1,000 times a second, the ESC just said. The ESC knows the RPM of the motor. That's how brushless ESCs work. And so instead of the flight controller having to ask the gyro what the RPM is and then do some calculations, we just get that data straight from the source. And what that means is that the flight controller can perfectly tune the notch filter in real time, instantly, with no additional delay. The new RPM filter has some advantages over the existing notch filters that are in Betaflight. So if we look here in the Betaflight configurator, we can see that here are what's known as the static notch filters, and these don't move around and they don't adapt to the motor frequency at all, and you can see that they've actually been turned off in Betaflight since I think 3.4. The disadvantage of the static notches is that because they're not able to adapt to the motor frequency in real time, they have to cover sort of any frequency that the motor might be at, from low to high. And they have to be very wide notches, and the wider the notch is, the less effective it is. Here in the configuration tab, there is the dynamic filter, and this is a dynamic notch filter that moves around. And that is what I was talking about at the beginning of the video, where you read the gyro and calculate some stuff on the data and figure out what the notch needs to be. But even the dynamic notch is not as good as the RPM filter. So the dynamic notch can only target the average of the motor frequencies. If one motor is at a high RPM and one motor is at a lower RPM because you're in a turn or something, the dynamic notch kind of just has to hit the middle, and that's not optimal. The dynamic notch does have some advantages over the static notches, the main advantage being that the dynamic notch is applied on the X, Y, and Z axis separately. There are 3 dynamic notches, and that is also true of the RPM filter, but the RPM filter is even better because the RPM filter can target each of the motor frequencies individually. So if one motor is spinning fast and one motor is spinning slow, the RPM filter will account for that on all 3 of the axes at the same time. That's, I guess that's like 4 different notch filters times 3 axes. That's 12 different notches that are active at any particular time, and that has led some people to jokingly refer to Betaflight 4.0 as notch flight. But don't let that sort of overwhelm you. They've actually implemented it in a very, very clever way. It's essentially like one of those equalizers that you see in the big equipment racks at the I don't know, wherever you see those things, the music store, where you can slide the equalizer up or down. Betaflight basically has a bank of notch filters that it can apply, and each one can be sort of turned on and off like 1,000 times a second. So actually, calculation-wise and CPU load-wise, this is actually very efficient. You might remember that the dynamic filter, it takes a lot of CPU utilization to process the dynamic filter. And that's not because the filter is CPU intensive, but it's because reverse engineering the gyro data to figure out what frequency the motors are at, that's the slow part. Since we're getting that information directly from the ESC with the RPM filter, we don't have to do that. So we're saving processor utilization, we're getting better filtering, we're getting lower delay. It's amazing. There is a downside. And the downside is that your ESCs currently don't support the telemetry that's needed to implement the RPM filter. What do you mean? My ESCs are BLHeli32 ESCs and they support telemetry? Nope. Regular BLHeli32 telemetry is not fast enough. It doesn't update enough to run the RPM filter. So what the Betaflight devs have done is they've implemented something called bidirectional D-Shot, and this is very exciting. By the Betaflight devs and the BLHeli devs working together. Credit to both. Bidirectional D-Shot means that your ESC telemetry wire, you don't need it anymore. That the ESC is going to send telemetry via the same D-Shot signal wire that you use, so you don't actually have to tie up a UART with ESC telemetry anymore. But it's not actually supported yet in a public release of BLHeli. Let's set up the RPM filter on a quad. And the reason I'm doing this is because I just got done reviewing the results from the first set of flights that I did, and they didn't look that different. And I think the reason is that the quad that I used has my JB2407 motors on, which are larger stator motors designed to have lots of torque, and it has pretty good prop wash handling to begin with, and it's a relatively new and tight quad, so it's very clean. Instead, I'm going to make the filter work a little harder by using this quad. This is my JB budget build, and it has DYS Samguk motors on. Now, these motors are not the smoothest or the best balanced from the day you get them. They're okay for the price, or I wouldn't have used them, but this quad actually has one of these motors that's actually pretty severely out of balance and makes a lot of vibration. And the frame is not like some ultra stiff, ultra tight Catalyst Machine Works smooth operator. It's the Rotor Riot CL1, which again, it's fine, but it's not the absolute best. So I think this will maybe show the difference a little more clearly. Let's do it. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to back up my configuration by going to the command line and typing diff. And I'm going to take all of that stuff. Actually, I can just hit save to file, and I'm going to save that out. That is my config dump. That is all of the configuration changes I've made to the quad. Okay, so now I've saved out my configuration. Yeah, 351. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to disconnect, and I'm going to put it in bootloader mode. So now I'm going to go to the firmware flasher, and I'm going to click show unstable releases, and I'm going to enable expert mode. And if you do not see enable expert mode here, you need to download the latest version of the configurator. It's confusing because I was on 10.4.0 and I didn't have that. And then I downloaded 10.4.0 and I installed it, and suddenly I had it. So just because you see 10.4.0 here doesn't necessarily mean that that's right. And I will put a link to where to download that if you're not sure down in the video description. But again, maybe you shouldn't be trying super de-duper preliminary experimental stuff if you don't already know where to find the configurator. No offense. The next thing you're going to need to do is get the hex file for your flight controller. And you need to know that not all flight controllers are supported as of today. So you're going to want to look in this list. Where's the list? There's the list. So here's the list of F4 flight controllers that are supported. Okay. And they just, like literally in the last 2 days, they just added some F7s. So you're going to need to get the hex file for your flight controller either from here, if you've got an F7, or some of these guys you can actually get simply by flashing from the configurator. So here in the configurator, if I put development and pick my board and choose my firmware version, you see I can pick 4.0.0. This is a nightly build of 4.0.0, and it will have the D-Shot binder feature in it. However, you should know that some of them require the D-Shot binder new targets branch, and if yours is one of these, you can get that by going to the Joe Lucid D-Shot binder test, and that is where you can get that firmware. I'm going to get this F7 hex file for my Kakute F7, which happens to be the flight controller. That is, oh, a lot of them are here. Yeah, it looks like, wow, it looks like all of the builds are here in the Joe Lucid RPM filter. There's some F4s here as well, so maybe you can just go here if you don't want to muck around with all that nonsense. Kakute F7 and Kakute F7 V2, which is correct for me. So here's the answer. In the config dump, you're going to look for the version command. Here it is. And you're just going to say Betaflight / this. This is your target that you need, Kakute F7 in my case. You can also just go to the command line and type version. Kakute F7, that is what you need. Whenever you flash your board, double check that you have the correct target, because if you flash the wrong target, bad things are going to happen. You won't break your board, but you may make it inaccessible and have to reset it and reflash it. So Kakute F7 is my target, not Kakute F7 V2. I'm going to click and download that. It's always a pain in the butt to download files from GitHub. Can I get it to download? Yeah. So you hit download and then you get this and you're like, what? You didn't download anything. What you got to do is you got to do right click, save as. I don't know if there's an easier way to do this. And then it wants to make it a text file. So we're going to change that to all files and we're going to remove the .txt extension, and Mac users are laughing their heads off right now because they don't have to deal with that nonsense. So now we have saved the hex file and we are going to flash the hex file to the board. We're going to hit load firmware, local. We're going to go to downloads and we are going to get that hex file and open it and flash it. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the command line. I'm going to put my config back in. I'm going to just do select all, copy, and then paste and hit enter. Now my configuration is back the way it was. So then I'm going to do the D-Shot specific stuff. And the D-Shot specific commands are right here in this wiki page. I'll put a link down in the video description. Here's the first thing we're going to do. Set D-Shot burst equals off. We're going to do set scheduler optimize rate equals on. And we're going to do set D-Shot BiDAR equals on. The last thing you're going to need to do is set the motor poles. And this is the number of poles on your motor. For most 5-inch motors, it's going to be 14 poles. You may need to look up the specs for your motors if you have motors of other sizes. The next thing we need to do is we need to check our loop time. And the loop time needs to be very, very close to the configured value. So normally you set your loop time to 4 kilohertz, 8 kilohertz, whatever you set it to, and it can vary fairly substantially and everything keeps working okay. But for the bidirectional filter to be used, it has to be very, very consistent. Here's how we check that. We're going to go to the command line and type tasks. And what we want to look at is the gyro/PID task. And what we want to see is that the rate/hertz is very close to our nominal loop time. So in this case, the rate/hertz is 79999. Here in the configuration tab, we're set to 8 kilohertz, and those two numbers are very, very close together, so everything is fine. If you have an F4 processor, you probably are going to be better off running 4K 4K and not 8K 8K. Some people have reported that they successfully run 8K on an F4, but the recommendation from the devs is to run 4K 4K. The next thing that we need to do is update the firmware on the ESCs, and we can get the custom firmware from this link, which is at the bottom of the wiki page for the bidirectional RPM filter and D-Shot. We're going to go to BLHeli32 test code rev3267 hex files, and we're going to pick the hex file for our specific ESC. In order to find out what that is, I'm going to plug in a battery. You need to plug in a battery to read the ESC. And I'm going to run BLHeli Suite 32. This is a BLHeli 32 ESC. You can't do this with BLHeli SESCs. I'm going to connect to my ESC. Oh, wrong. There we go. And I'm going to read setup. What we need to know is that this is a Typhoon 32 ESC. Great. Okay. So Typhoon 32. Here we go. Typhoon 32 multi3267.hex. We're going to pull that down. Oh, no. Here we go again. We're going to hit raw. We're going to get this stupid thing. We're going to do right-click, save as, change it from a text file to all files, and remove the .txt extension. Boom. Now it's downloaded. And then we're going to flash that file to the ESCs. So from BLHeli, I'm going to hit Flash BLHeli. And then instead of selecting from the pull down here, I'm going to choose Ignore this list, pick a file. And it's hopefully filled in the name. That's nice. I'm going to go to where I downloaded the file, and there it is. Now there's a catch here that tripped me up for the longest time, and I'm going to tell you about it in 1 second. So we're going to flash. Oh, wait, no. First I want to make a note here. Okay, so motors 1 and 4 are reversed. Let's make a note of that. So now we've finished flashing ESC number 1. Do you want to write the current settings to ESC number 1? I recommend that you say no here and that you just manually set the ESCs up from scratch. And one reason for that is that if you have music like Game of Thrones music or custom startup tones, that actually screws up bidirectional D-shot. You cannot have the musical notes configured, and you can't even have the musical notes like entered but turned off. So rather than screw around with that, I would say just do not write the current settings to ESC1. Manually set it up from scratch to make sure that your ESCs are completely fresh. So I'm going to say no here. And then this is where you're going to make the mistake that I did. If you just hit OK here, it's going to flash 32.6 to the second, third, and fourth ESCs, and they won't work. So again, you need to do ignore the list, pick a file, and yes, and then it flashes. And you need to keep doing that for all 4 of the ESCs. Each time you go ignore the list, pick a file, ignore the list, pick a file. And I'm like, BLHeli, come on. Why the F would I ever want ESC number 1 to have 32.6 on it and ESC number 2 to have a different firmware? Why would I ever want any of my ESCs to not have the same firmware version on it? Why do I have to do this individually? For goodness sake. This is the dumbest thing I've ever seen in user interface design. Can I just have an option to flash all of the ESCs with the same freaking firmware? Please. You have no idea how long I sat and went back and forth with Joe Lucid and Steve I'm sorry, Steve, I can't say your last name. You have no idea how much of their time I wasted trying to get this working, because when I flashed my ESCs, I only flashed the first one with the freaking firmware, and then I just hit yes, 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 and flashed the remainders. Why would you do it that way? Okay, moving on. We'll just check ESC overview and see that everything is correct. Yep. Okay, now you're ready to test if your motors are going to spin. And here's how you do that. The first thing you need to do is unplug USB. The flight controller cannot be powered up first, because what happens is when the flight controller and the ESCs power up, the flight controller basically says to the ESC, do you want to do bidirectional D-shot? No? Okay, and then that's it. Your moment has passed. So if the flight controller powers up first and the ESCs are not powered up, this isn't going to work. The motors will still spin, but you won't get bidirectional D-shot, I think. I'm not 100% sure about that. What you need to do is first plug in the battery. Okay, that's a good sign. And then plug in USB. We're going to hit connect. We're going to go to the motors tab, and we're going to see if our motors spin. That's not encouraging. Let's try this without D-shot 1200. Maybe that's not the best choice. That's not a good sign, folks. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, at this point, I would have to reach out to one of the devs who I have a line of communication with to figure out why this isn't working. This is an F7 flight controller, and they only just started working on making this work with F7s. So I think probably the answer is that it's just not quite working yet. I did get it working using these exact same steps on my CLRacing F4, or it's the JB F4, but it uses the CLRacing target. If you get to this point and it doesn't work, either you messed up one of the previous steps, or it's just not working for your flight controller yet. Most F4s that are listed on the wiki should work. As you can see, F7's still maybe not quite ready for prime time. So the bad news is that I can't test this quad with the beat up janky motors for prop wash. You're just going to have to go off the footage from this guy, which is pretty good on the best day. But I do have one idea for how I can make this test a little bit better for you. I am going to intentionally screw up the props. And do the test again. So let's see how that works. I gotta say, I've heard stories from people like Ryan Harrell, who flew the RPM filter and went, holy cow. He literally said this is the biggest development since active braking in ESCs. He felt it was such a big deal. I would love to hear your experience with this if you decide to give this a try, and if it makes a huge difference for you. I suspect that on relatively clean quads, it's going to not make as much of a difference, and that on dirtier quads or quads that already have really poor prop wash handling, maybe it'll make a bigger difference. But, you know, I've already put like 2 full days into this video. We're going to call this one. The people who are working on this feature are so excited about it that it's hard for me to ignore that. But I have to say, from just a scientific perspective of what I have seen in my testing, it didn't knock my socks off with a difference in feel, and it didn't knock my socks off when I was looking at the videos. If you were to show me these videos and say, without telling me which one was which, I probably would have a hard time picking them apart. And that's the conclusion I got to come to. And the bottom line is, it's coming. It's no worse, and if it helps improve the filtering and gets rid of the ESC telemetry wire, hey, I'm all for it. So that is going to do it for this video. Thanks for sticking around if you have stuck around, but that's going to do it for me. Happy flying.